globe. We have on the screen right now an image of three of the more well-known populist movements throughout the world. The middle picture is a picture of the Filipino president Duterte. He is a former police chief, someone who was running on the idea of cleaning up the streets for everyday Filipinos. He has produced a number of very thinly centrist ideologies that we can see, and these policies often are communicated in unideological ways. He's a straight talker. He often has expressed homophobic beliefs, racist beliefs, and xenophobic beliefs, beyond also some classist beliefs, looking at the poorest individuals in Philippines. He's often demonized and criminalized. He has also run a anti-drug program that has relied on summary executions of drug dealers. Very popular in the Philippines because he's tackling a everyday problem and he's using very common direct language to discuss it. We also have Erdogan, the president of Turkey. He was someone who ran on a Muslim identity, a popular Muslim identity. He gets a lot of his political support from outside the cosmopolitan capitals of Turkey. We can think about the capital, Istanbul, is one of the oldest cosmopolitan centers in the Western world. It used to be Constantinople. It was a Greek colony as well, or Greek settlement as well. So there is a huge cosmopolitan history. It was the seat of the Ottoman Empire as well, one of the largest empires to ever know the world, see the face of the world. So these are all things that are being referenced. The formerly great nature of Turkey is now going to be returned by Erdogan's practices, by his politics, by his support of the popular Muslim classes in Brazil, or in Turkey. We also see Chavismo in Venezuela. It is based around the political philosophies of Hugo Chavez and the political cult of Hugo Chavez. He is a communist, so something that is economically opposed to Duterte and Erdogan. Chavez really was sympathetic to two specific political figures throughout history. The first was Simon Bolivar. Bolivar was the revolutionary leader of South America. He's the George Washington of South America, or rather, George Washington is the Simon Bolivar of the United States. He helped liberate most of South America, and he believed that there should have been a pan-South American country, something that was there to uplift the working classes and something that was anti-establishment, anti-elite. That goes back to the early part of the 19th century. We also see that he is inspired deeply by Fidel Castro's communist revolution. Now, Chavez did not want to have a violent revolution, even though he was a former military commander. He had an attempted coup attempt, but he eventually won the general election with principal support from the working classes of Venezuela, who were being historically excluded from some of the largest oil deposits and oil wealth being produced in the world, even to this day. Chavez made those resources public, used that to build a huge social infrastructure for this previously excluded popular working class Venezuelan. He passed away a few years ago, and in his stead, we see there is a political system, a populist movement that still exists without that charismatic leader. And there are some leaders in the movement, but they are not as ideologically and charismatically focused or representative of Chavismo as Hugo Chavez was. Then we have Donald Trump, who pretty much harnessed resentment towards the liberal elite in Washington to earn the vote of middle America, to earn the vote of white America, to earn the vote of middle class America. And he did this based off of the argument that he was going to economically empower those individuals. He was going to go to rural America, who was getting left out and forgotten by the contemporary political discussion, which often concentrates wealth and power and political authority on the two coasts, on the coastal elites. And he also harnessed this idea that there was a racial dynamic to America. And there is a racial dynamic to America, but often politicians don't directly and explicitly harness it to their advantage. Donald Trump was very much opposed to Muslim immigration and very much opposed to Latino immigration. And these are two very racialized arguments that he was making, that the Muslim immigration is specifically a part of the world that is non-European, non-white, and he was using fear, often stoked by a few generations of wars that the United States have waged in the Middle East. But he was also harnessing the fear of a different religion that was non-Christian. He's appealing to a Christian majority in the United States. He's also harnessing the fear of the national boundaries getting invaded by a foreign entity. Specifically, he's constructing this us versus them mentality. He's looking at the American state, the American people are being dramatically affected by illegal immigration. That's the term that he uses. We can also talk about it as undocumented aliens or undocumented immigrants. We can see that there is many different ways to talk about this. Donald Trump was and is still using the discussion that, or the argument that there is a foreign force invading the United States, so us versus them. If we look at modern Brazil, we have a similarly populist-leaning president in Jair Bolsonaro. He's a former paratrooper, former military man. He actually at one time attempted to overthrow the Brazilian government by having a pipe bomb in his barracks and blowing up a bridge. Very problematic and weird plot that never really fully materialized. He was a young man in the 1980s, immediately after the fall of the dictatorship. And he was one of the few supporters of the military dictatorship. He really believed that the military regime was able to bring order to Brazil. He used this ideology to become a federal representative of a working class neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro, a neighborhood that's very closely associated with a military barracks and also some factories and a working middle class. He was able to repeat some of the things that if you go to the corner bar in Brazil that you'll probably hear every day, and he sort of has that mentality. He has that old guy that goes to the bar and complains about politics tone to him, and it works. It's very dynamic. People seem to be compelled by what he's saying. Not everyone, of course. He's very divisive in many ways, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he has this ability for people to identify with him. That kind of guy that you can go and have a barbecue with. That type of popular comparison that individuals make. He's anti-communist, so this is a specific philosophy that he has, even though it's not really grounded in an alternative philosophy. He's just anti-communist, and he uses a lot of Cold War rhetoric to discuss how he is opposed to social programs, how he's opposed to communist countries in general, specifically Venezuela. He has a frequent talking point of deriding Venezuela and saying that his government is opposed to this. He's homophobic, he's a Christian, and he uses his Christianity to justify his homophobia. This is something that, once again, evangelical Brazilians really identify with. This is a common feature of evangelical Christianity, being opposed to homosexuality, being opposed to gay marriage. Jair Bolsonaro is right on top of that and using that as an argument to help win votes. He's also a law and order president or politician, someone who is frequently said, bandido bom e bandido morto, a good bandit or a good criminal is a dead criminal. So he's very much in favor of using extrajudiciary force, summary executions to help control problems with crime and violence in Brazil. Some of the key populist moments that we can see in Jair Bolsonaro's career have taken place on the national stage. He has had some key moments during the 1990s where he would go on television and promote the dictatorship, something that was very much taboo. Many people saw the dictatorship for what it was, as a brutal regime that suppressed democratic thought. But Bolsonaro was a rabble rouser. He was willing to go out on TV and express his support. Many people liked the dictatorship. Many people benefited from the dictatorship. Many people believe that the dictatorship did good things. I don't necessarily believe that. I'm diametrically opposed to the idea of lack of representation and lack of democratic philosophy and institutions. And that's something that would give people pause promoting dictatorships to my face. This is something that Jair Bolsonaro, was very much opposed to. He did not care about making people upset, talking about how he supported dictatorship. This allowed him to really develop a political base without an ideology. He was someone that was opposed to PC talk. He was someone who was opposed to the broader discussion of direitos humanos, human rights, that was often getting discussed around people from the favela, people from the shantytown. And just to summarize this, in 2016, he got up in front of the National Congress during the impeachment vote for President Dilma Rousseff. And in this, he stated, pela memória do Coronel Alberto Brilhante Ustra, o pavor da Dilma Rousseff pelo exército de Caxias, pelas Forças Armadas, pelo Brasil acima de tudo e por Deus em cima de todo, o meu voto é sim. This is his justification for voting yes against impeachment. Just a little background on Dilma Rousseff. She was, during the 1960s and 70s, a communist agitator. She was arrested and tortured by one Colonel Carlos Alberto Brilhante Ustra, who, in this first statement, in his very first phrase in this declaration, is being praised by Jair Bolsonaro. So, in his vote to yes to impeach Dilma, he is voting in favor of Dilma and dedicating his vote to the person who tortured her during the military regime. He's also praising the military, Exército de Caxias. He's also praising the Brazilian people, and this actually became his political catchphrase during his subsequent run for president. Pelo Brasil em cima de tudo e por Deus acima de todo. Brazil above all and God above everything. This is a very nationalistic and Christian inflected statement. And this is how he was getting power. He was putting all of these very controversial populist statements into very understandable and digestible soundbites. He got spit on a bunch of times in the National Congress. He was vilified, incredibly vilified, by people who opposed him ideologically, people who might sympathize with communists, people who might be opposed to the dictatorship. He was villainized very much in the open. But after this impeachment, Brazil seemed like it was shifting very much towards this populist thin center that was discussed by Mazzarella. We see that in the presidential run in 2018, his main political rally strategy, he didn't give speeches necessarily. He would give speeches, but they'd be very flamboyant and funny and offhand. They would really focus on key accusations that the communist government of Venezuela was trying to take over Brazil, that the socialists in Brazil were corrupt, and that they were elitists that were not working for the average Brazilian. And he would go through these middle-sized towns in Brazil, these middle-sized cities, maybe cities between 200,000 and a million people. And he would more or less be carried on the back by a security guard and wave at people, and people would touch him. It'd be this very embodied experience. He would be someone who would be enveloped by his people. And so this would be something that he was able to show that he was part of the people, that his ideology was rooted in the everyday experiences of individuals. Of course, these individuals were already in support of a lot of his philosophies and his ideologies and his political beliefs, and this just helped to solidify his populist image. One of the craziest moments in this campaign came during these moments of waving and being part of the crowd. A mentally unstable man supposedly came up and stabbed him. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened. There's even a conspiracy theory that he might have had cancer and they didn't want to divulge that he had cancer. There's arguments that there's no video that actually shows him getting stabbed, that it was digitally altered. All these are sort of crazy conspiracy theories because what happened after he got stabbed, so he was in this crowd, got stabbed. You can look up the video. There's a lot of videos circulating, a lot of cell phone videos that are around. He is more or less made into a hero. He is more or less seen as someone who is willing to sacrifice his blood and his life for Brazil, something that his political rivals were unable to demonstrate, something that even though they could have a rhetoric and a discourse that might appeal to the poor in Brazil, the working class in Brazil, they didn't necessarily have this charismatic dynamic that Jair Bolsonaro had. So Bolsonaro is running against a socialist. Some people assumed that he would have a tough time against a former president, Lula. Lula gets imprisoned. Lula's successor, Dilma, was just impeached. And so they elect a young man, relatively young man. He's in his 40s, middle-aged, but for presidential terms, he's relatively young. He's the former mayor of Sao Paulo. He's the former education minister. He's a professor, a university professor, very far to the left, very much in support of social programs, very much in support of a more liberal idea of identity and inclusion that includes multiple different perspectives and multiple different experiences of the world that run counter to the Christian and homophobic ideologies that was often becoming the social baseline for the presidential election. And he just wasn't charismatic enough to compete with this more visceral, embodied popular movement that Jair Bolsonaro was leading. What are some of the results of this Bolsonaro era? We can see that there is a pushback, right? People are critiquing Bolsonaro for being oppressive. And there's also a concentration of populist thought in institutions of authority in Brazil. Now, one of the best examples of this is the short film, The First Temptation of Christ. I definitely recommend watching it. It is a satire of Christian normativity in Brazil, of Christian populism in Brazil, and it is critiquing a lot of the normative standards that are now in vogue in Brazil, the populist standards that are informed Brazilian thinking for the last few years. What happens in the movie, more or less, Jesus Christ, the savior of the Christian religion, is depicted as a gay man. And this is seen as a form of blasphemy and also is something that's illegal in Brazil. Blasphemy can be illegal in Brazil. It eventually gets censored by the Minister of Communications in Brazil and a few other countries throughout the world who are often led by populist governments who also align themselves with a Christian identity. So this depiction of Jesus as gay is opposed to the populist identity that Jair Bolsonaro is trying to establish. As a result, the movie gets censored, one of the first and largest examples of censorship in Brazil since the dictatorship. So we see sort of a full circle here of both inclusionary dynamics, this idea of being an inclusionary Brazilian identity that tries to harness a broad national identity. And then we see that it is used to punish individuals who are in conflict with that identity. And one thing as you watch the movie, I definitely recommend thinking about this. How does the reaction to this short film symbolize Brazil's populist turn and the Bolsonaro era? Some of the lessons of contemporary global populism that we can take then is that it doesn't have to be charismatic, but it often is. We often see politicians are capable of finding the lowest common denominator that is able to unite a large group of people around rather simple thoughts of identity, around simple thoughts of us versus them, and that there is a way for this popular idea to become influential in an institutional way that is used to deconstruct liberal or conservative ideology of the elite. This is a unconscious process, but remains fundamental to the ways that we can describe political thought in the contemporary